Well, good afternoon and welcome back to our verse-by-verse study in 1 Peter. And today we'll be starting chapter 3 and we'll be looking at verses 1 through 7. Now, as you recall, at the end of chapter 2, where we had left off on Wednesday, we saw that God, through the pen of Peter, instructed us as Christian citizens and as Christian servants that we were to be loyal. And even though Caesar was not kind to the Christians and some masters were cruel to Christians, we're still to be loyal and to honor the government and the masters as if we were honoring God. Now today Peter is going to turn his attention really to husbands and wives and how they should respect and honor each other. Now as we read this and as we look at this, you'll also recall that Paul talks significantly about these. He talked about it in 1 Corinthians 7 and in Ephesians 5, Colossians 3. He talked about it in 1 Timothy and in Titus. So quite a bit of information is throughout the New Testament on how husbands and wives should relate to each other. But for now, let's go ahead and read 1 Peter 3, verses 1 through 7. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the world, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of your hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear. But let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children, if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to women as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of grace, in the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. So now we want to take a look at what some of our then principles. And I think that there's some things we really have to understand about the culture of the first century so we can understand some of these then principles. Some people say that really Peter gives the instruction to the women, verses 1 through 6, versus just verse 7, so 6 times as much. And I don't really want to get into semantics or all that, but if you look at it, the 6 verses are really only 4 times the length of verse 7. But there's really reasons for this, because really in the Roman world, women had very few rights. And everywhere that the gospel of Christ had been preached and practiced, the status of women tended to improve. And so Peter wants to caution these Christian women into taking undue liberties with their newfound freedom and dignity. Right? And marriage is a divine ordinance, and Christianity should only enhance it, not separate it. So the position really of Christian women in the pagan society was more difficult than that of men. And there were probably more believers among women than among men. So really, what were Christian women who were married to unbelieving husbands supposed to do? Well, Peter tells them that they're not supposed to leave their husbands, nor were they supposed to rebel against them. All right? That they should show their good and quiet spirit. Now, Peter also goes on to say that the subordination doesn't really speak about function or inferiority between the two partners, between the two sexes. But what he does say, though, is that women should submit to their husbands. Now, pagan husbands would probably never hear the gospel of Christ through the wife's preaching, but they would hear and understand it through the actions of their wife. And so that's what Peter is telling them, is to show the gospel in the way you act. When we move into verses 3 and 4, we see another reason really why the instructions to women just seem like a lot longer. And here Paul really starts to talk about, Peter starts to talk about that age-old problem that we seem to have, and that is, how do we adorn ourselves? How do we dress? How do we operate? And what God is telling us is, don't use external ornaments, right? That save that for the inside, to have that good and quiet spirit. Now you have to remember that Roman women, they use very elaborate ornaments. They put combs in their hair and jewelry and loud dresses. Some of them would wear wigs. There was a lot of attention that was paid to how they outwardly looked. And what Christ was saying, what Peter is saying for God here, is that it matters what you look like on the inside. Now, certainly God is not opposed to ornamentation. Just take a look at creation. Look at the stars. Look at how everything is out there. It is just amazing. Right? But what he's really saying is that's not what's important. What's important is what's on the inside. Now, when we get down to verse 7, really, the list may be short that Peter gave, but it's really impressive of how husbands should act to men, right? It says they're to treat their wives basically with consideration, with chivalry, and as co-equals. And he tells them to do this, that their prayers will not be hindered. That if they don't treat their wives with consideration, with chivalry, and as co-equals, then their prayers would be hindered. But you can see that based on culture, there was a lot that God was saying through Peter to these Christian wives and husbands. But these principles still hold true today. That men and women are co-heirs. They are partners in the marriage. And we see that really kind of in our now principles. When we take a look at our now principles, we see that God does not expect the marriage to be one-sided. He expects it to be partners. And that if it is just one-sided, really, that marriage is probably doomed. And I think the other important now principle really is that God is always looking at the inside, which is what he told Samuel some 3,000 years ago when he was looking to ordain a new king. And he went through the whole line of Jesse's sons until he finally got to David, the youngest and the scrawniest of them all. God looks on the inside, not on the outside. So now, how is this passage speaking to you today? What are your now principles? Please let me know. Leave a comment. Send an email. I know that this is a tough passage, but it's a passage that we have to deal with. Come on back next Monday as we continue on in our verse-by-verse study here in 1 Peter chapter 3. Till then, be safe. And as always, go with God's grace and with the peace that only He can provide. Amen.